Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Matthew Schoen Sociology Show. Sociology 101 specifically. I'm making this video to pass along the lecture information to you about racial and ethnic inequality. The last time that we met, we spoke at length, or I guess I should say I spoke at length about the social construction of race and ethnicity. And despite the fact that it's a social construction, we did end that lecture by noting some of the many ways in which this does ripple forward into our lives and send our lives careening into different directions. So I ended last time by discussing the concept of institutional discrimination. That's the agenda for today. That's it. That's really all I want to cover, although I'm going to show a lot of data on that. So moving forward, I guess I should say before I get started, those of you in Group A, you guys are writing a paper for me, so that does need to be submitted on the course page at the normal time. See the Dropbox. I will be in virtual office hours on Thursday. Please don't hesitate to reach out if and when questions or concerns develop. Also, I'm filming this on Tuesday, March 17th. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I did not forget to wear my green. All right, so let me start by refreshing our memory about this issue of institutional discrimination. So I ended by saying that discrimination was the removal of opportunities or resources from certain groups of people when those resources are available in an easier fashion to other groups of people. Okay, so that's discrimination. When we institutionalize it, here's the definition that I would be most comfortable using. It's the customs, the attitudes, and the structural arrangements, right? It's just the normal operations of society that serve to ultimately create a disadvantaged social situation for certain groups, while others end up being able to advantage themselves out of what that situation is, okay? So what that means, what that does in practice is it builds patterns of inequality into institutions that can perpetuate themselves really without any direct intent or any direct direction from individuals themselves. Once it's institutionalized, it's a lot harder to root out. It's just a lot harder to bring groups up to equal treatment when you have decades, in many cases centuries, of institutionalized patterns being just baked into the very structures of our society, okay? So what that does, it creates a situation where inequality is often not really being pursued by anybody specifically, although that obviously does still happen, becomes just kind of the way it is. And that has massive, just preposterous effects on individuals' lives. So if you remember your prep for the SAT or the ACT, whatever it is people take out here, inequality can take two forms. And if you remember your Latin roots from SAT prep, can be de jure or de facto. I'm going to focus today very heavily on de facto inequality and discrimination, okay? De jure is a Latin term that means from the law. So if you think about an institution like slavery, for example, that's very clear law, discrimination through the law. You think about something like Jim Crow in the post-Reconstruction, pre-Civil Rights Southern United States. Well, even there, we still see a similar thing that is very much legal discrimination. But you may be thinking to yourself, all right, well, hey, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Homeownership Act, all yada, yada, yada. What is it with society that we see these same patterns being passed forward into the future, even though the direct actions have been outlawed in many cases? And that's what's most commonly known as de facto discrimination. De facto means of the facts, just kind of the way things are. So institutions, we stressed this very much during my lecture on structural functionalism. We stressed very strongly about how institutions are interconnected. They are interdependent with one another. So some type of pattern developing in one institution does not stay within that institution. It ripples out and affects the group in other institutions. So I'm going to start with just a very simple statistical fact, and one that I don't really want to dive into too much right now because I want to chart its direction throughout people's life courses. Here I just have a very simple graph from the Prison Policy Initiative. What is your lifetime chance of being sent to prison at the current US incarceration rates? We have very simple groups here. All Americans, that's 6%, which is stunningly high when you compare to any other industrialized democracy in the world. But still, that's 94%. I don't go to prison. Sweet. Once you start looking at everything else, though, now it gets a little bit more complicated. For males, it's 11%. It's double the rate of the entire United States population. Okay, so but still 9 out of every 10, not so bad, right? I mean, I guess I'll take my chances on that. 9 out of 10 chance I don't go to prison. And it is very much in my best interest to not go to prison. Now I look at Hispanic men, 17%. Okay, now these numbers are going in a direction that I really don't like. And then we get to the most spectacularly high rate of incarceration. African-American men, 32% chance of being in some form of the criminal justice system at any point through the life course. Now, if you go to prison, that sucks for you because you're in prison, but it also sucks for the rest of your life and how it can ripple out to any other institution that you might be relying upon in order to organize your life. So we have this very simple social fact. Prison rates are not race neutral. Now, if you go to prison, I want you to think very briefly now about other ways that might affect your life. And if the first thing that came to mind for you was your ability to get a job, congratulations, you're right. It's not your imagination. This will be an example of what is known as side effect discrimination. It's a practice in one institution that negatively impacts a group in another institution, okay? So here we have a clear connection between the labor market, the institution of the labor market, and the institution of the criminal justice system, okay? So I want to present some data here from a fairly famous article by Diva Pager. Just a quick detour on this. Diva Pager was a fantastic sociologist. She was somebody I really admired. She died about a year ago, actually. 46 years old, just ovarian cancer that just got out of control. So don't take it for granted, guys, I guess. What she did was something known as an audit study. An audit study is the closest thing we can often get in the social sciences to an experiment. An experiment is a situation where you keep everything constant except one variable. And then if the outcome changes, you can usually be pretty sure that it's as a result of that one variable that you changed. So what people do with certain things like trying to rent an apartment or trying to get a job, things like that, they want to see the effect of race or gender or immigration status, what have you. They'll send resumes or job applications changing one and only one thing on the resume and just see who's more likely to get a call back. Okay. So what we're seeing on this graph here, entry-level job callbacks. They sent a bunch of job applications to jobs at the entry level, exactly the type of thing that you might be expecting to get or look for when you get out of prison. And they found that there is a very clear racial and ethnic breakdown or pattern in who gets a callback, right? So 31% of white applications did receive a callback, 25% of Hispanic Latino, and only 15.2% of Black. So, okay, so we have some clear discrimination that's already baked into getting a job in the first place. But remember, we're talking about the side effects side of this, okay? Positive responses by race, ethnicity, and a criminal record, now it starts to get really upsetting because I can see that for white felons, the rate is now 17.2%, which is far decreased from where it was for everybody, which was 31%. So here, all the researchers did was change the race, but then also give some people a clean record and some people, I have been convicted of a crime at some point. Moving on from that, we can very clearly see that, okay, going to prison is bad for everybody, regardless of your background. It's a catastrophe for your life chances. But while 17.2% of white felons received a callback, compare that to 15.4% of Latinos with a clean record and 13% of Blacks with a clean record. And now it starts to get very clear that, yeah, the more like you go to prison. First of all, we have two elements of side effect discrimination here. One is because Blacks are so much more likely to go to prison, they're going to bear the brunt of this in a very disproportional way. But we can also see that the mark of a criminal record is simply not the same across racial groups. It does appear to disadvantage particularly Black men, in a way that it just doesn't disadvantage anybody else, right? Everybody else suffers from this, but it seems one group suffers much more. And that is not coincidentally the very same group that is most likely to go to prison in the first place, okay? So we can see how a racial pattern in the criminal justice system creates a racial pattern in the employment system, okay? That leads me to my next type of point here, something that is known as past and present discrimination. These are neutral practices, or I guess I should say apparently neutral practices in the present that perpetuate inequalities of the past. So if I just take a very quick look at maybe a place that some of you want to go, like a lot of college students often have ambitions of going to some place like law school. So if we look at the University of Michigan's law school, 25% of their incoming class every year is reserved for what's known as a legacy student. Now, a legacy student means that you come from a family with a history of graduating from that institution. Many schools give preference to legacy applications when they are creating their class. It's not hard to see why they would want to do that. If you can create something like a family history, right, a family identification with a school or university, then it makes it more likely that a family would be willing to donate large sums of money so that place can build a new gym or something like that. That place can build a new science laboratory. So if 25% of the class is legacy students, hey, last I checked, legacy is not a racial identity. Nobody fills out the census and says, well, I'm a University of Michigan Law School legacy. But by baking in 1/4 of the class being legacy students, what that does is create a situation where you are now taking 25% from a group that was just not very diverse at all, right? Going back into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had cohorts of minorities who were simply not able to access these educational opportunities in the slightest. So it serves to kind of backdoor advantage white applicants just by virtue of their parents not being discriminated against in the same way, even though people may not be treating it as a racial thing anymore. If we look at it as at the level of undergrads, we can see a similar thing. Harvard reserves about 1/3 of their class for legacy students. Even as Harvard gets more diverse, this is still something that drags people forward out of a more racialized past into a present where they say race has no bearing in terms of admittance. But we know that can't be true. Like, we know that in the era of affirmative action, something like a quota is illegal. But at the same time, we also do know that Harvard kind of has to make it artificially difficult for Asians to get in, in the interest of creating the type of class that they want. So you add all this up, and the groups that have suffered the most discrimination throughout the country's history are going to have the hardest time climbing over this wall and into the institutions that can really help them. Because I don't think I need to explain to you what a Michigan law degree or what a Harvard undergraduate degree can maybe do for you throughout your life. Okay? Which is a really good segue into the next thing I want to talk about, the issue of education. Everybody tells you that education is the key to success. Everybody tells you that education is the best mechanism that you have for pushing your own life forward. Let's look at who's getting one then. If we have racial inequalities in educational attainment, we're going to have racial inequalities in skill attainment, and that will affect the amount of money that people ultimately make, okay? So what you're seeing here is high school and college. The red bars here are the percent of each group that has completed high school. The blue bars, the percent of each group that has completed college. There's no serious black-white gap for high school completion. In fact, we generally see a real strong Latino disadvantage there. And that's not all driven by immigration either, like people who have immigrated to the United States who would have done their college education elsewhere. That is a pattern that still holds even in the absence of even while controlling for an immigration variable. But we can see that there's not a big black-white gap there. Cubans do almost as well as everybody else. Why do the authors single out Cubans here? Really because Cubans tend to be the whitest Latinos possible, and that ends up being a pretty good reference point for what being Latino means, white versus black versus mixed. Very severe disadvantage here for Mexican Americans. So we can kind of see how that, we can conceptualize how that's going to ripple forward into the rest of the life course. Then when we look at college, though, the biggest gap starts to appear. About 50% of all Asian Americans have finished college. For whites, that's about 30%, but for blacks, 18.5%, only 9% for Mexican Americans. Okay. Let me go back here. So that's where we see the biggest gap here. What this is creating is a situation where, like, we know in a population, not everybody is going to be of equivalent educational levels. But is that going to be randomly distributed, or is that going to be racialized by group patterns in our society? It seems to me that the latter is much more likely to be true. So why are you here? Why are you listening to this lecture, right? It's because you know deeply and inherently that an education is something that is an investment in your life, is something that you can take forward with you. Like they always say, once you get an education, no one can ever take that degree away from you. And there is an element of truth to that, okay? So what we want out of an education is the ability to make a living. We want to make a living that's good, one that sustains us. We want to make a living that allows us to live a good life. I mean, that's why I don't really complain about, debt, student loans, anything like that, because like, I in no way feel like my education held me back. In fact, I feel quite the opposite. So then if we look at employment, there is a lot going on this graph here. So I want to break this down. You see gender splits, racial ethnic splits, and occupational splits. Really, for everything that's included in this graph, this is really not a terrible presentation of data because the colors really jump out at you. So what I want you to look at specifically is, let's start at the bottom of the graph. The service sector, production, transportation, and material moving, and then natural resources, construction, and maintenance, right? So this is all going to be kind of blue collar work. If I look at the Hispanic Latino graphs here and I look at the Black African American graph, I can see a very clear pattern that there's an overrepresentation in service work. There's an overrepresentation in construction or in production and like truck driving, things like that. Then I go to the white and Asian side of the graph here, and there's a real overrepresentation of management and professional fields. Where would you rather be, in the service sector or the professional and management field? I hope you answered the professional or management field. So in order to get there, right, in order to work in an office setting or a management setting or a professional setting, often that requires a college education, and often that requires more than just a college education. So now when I see how people are actually making a living, I can see how racial inequality occurs throughout the life course, right? It was harder for certain people to get a good lower education, therefore they couldn't get a higher education, therefore they get concentrated in some less attractive elements of the economy. Okay. Now, I'm a big believer that if you wake up in the morning and you go to work and you put the time in, you deserve respect. Like, that is something that you deserve respect on. But we know that this isn't going to pay the same. We know this isn't going to be something that allows you to make it to the middle class or the upper middle class with as much ease if you are in the service or the construction industry. And so as a result, because there's this over concentration of Blacks and Latinos in service work, the median incomes and that wealth accumulation kind of becomes lower as a result from that. And these jobs are not always the most attractive things to be doing, but it's actually even a little more serious than that. Like, I realize people don't necessarily, like, it's probably not an attractive or a sexy thing to be a garbage man, but those people are in unions making good money, working basically only in the morning. and they have health insurance and they have pensions and retirement plans. A lot of service work lately is really transitioning into areas where those jobs do not have health insurance, those jobs do not offer any type of retirement support, and it becomes a very serious problem. Okay, I'll pause there just to let everyone get caught up. So as we've been going through this, what you really should be internalizing is the idea that if there is a racial pattern in one area of society, that ripples out. That does not just stay in that particular area of that society. Okay. And perhaps because of this, I just argued about how some of these jobs are not particularly very good or not particularly, really sustaining for the life course. If we look at both the unemployment rate and the jobless rate, that's higher for Black men in particular at every level of education. So what you're seeing here is the effect of the recession, the last serious one that we had 2009 through 2011, thereabouts. You're seeing the unemployment rate for men at varying levels of education. So if you have a college degree, that's good. It does guard you against unemployment, but I see a white unemployment rate, even during a recession for college graduates, 4.5% to 8.5% when I cross the Black-white divide. With high school diplomas, 10 to 16%. Less than high school, 14% to 24%. 24% of Black men without a high school degree are not in the labor force. And that is going to do very, very damaging things for their ability to be full, productive, and flourishing members of society. Okay, well, why is the unemployment rate so much higher at these areas? Well, we've kind of gone through it, right? There's the stigma associated with, there's sort of outright racism that occurs, but also it's a group that didn't get invested in at nearly the same level in terms of treatment in school, right? Ability to go to college, ability to pay for that college. And so what we see here is that even though education is good for everybody, it does seem to carry more weight for whites and Asians in particular than for other groups within your society. Okay. And when I look at this, I'm thinking ahead, right? I'm thinking ahead to this recession that we're about to enter in, that we're currently in as of about a few days ago. I just think, like, who's not going to be able to work from home? Who isn't going to be able to take care of themselves, excuse me, in this economy? Who isn't going to have an employer that will continue paying them for a time in which the business has to be closed as a result of the epidemic? The recession we're about to enter in is going to be tough. A lot of people are going to have their savings wiped out, but it's going to particularly hammer the group of people that was already the most tenuous in the first place. And why were those people the most tenuous in the first place? All this institutional discrimination that had occurred throughout the life course, right? So it kind of, it ripples out. I absolutely cannot stress that enough. All right, so moving on from that then, I previously mentioned I've tried to organize these slides in a way that they will very naturally kind of flow together. I'm going to grab a graph here of Americans lacking health insurance. And I grabbed 2013 data because this is right before the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate went into effect. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on Obamacare, some positive, some negative, and I'll give you those in a few weeks when we do when I do my healthcare lecture. But this is what it looked at right before everybody was required to have health insurance, okay? And I can see a real serious thing here. Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians all more likely to lack health insurance than whites, right? And that right now, I mean, I did not plan this lecture to be about the racial effects of the epidemic that's going on right now, but groups that have bad health insurance or no health insurance at all, this is going to be very, very difficult, right? It's going to be very difficult for people to get affordable medical coverage, because that's one of the misconceptions about healthcare. People always say, like, X number of Americans lack access to healthcare. Who? Who do you know? Who do you know that lacks access to healthcare? The problem is they may lack access to affordable, accessible healthcare. So even if it's in your community without insurance, without the ability to pay for these things, that's functionally the same as not having access to healthcare. So you will remember I spoke at length about Russian men dying last week when we actually had an in-person class, and I spoke at length about males dying at an earlier age than females. The areas where we see this most commonly and most apparently is in preventative care, right? If you can't go for a checkup or you don't feel like you can afford a $155 doctor visit, or pre and neonatal care, that's where this tends to show up the most. And so we should be able to peg this to A, life expectancy as a result of stuff that maybe could have been caught in a preventative matter, and also, unfortunately, the infant mortality rate, okay? The United States infant mortality rate is shockingly high compared to other industrialized democracies. Nationwide, it's about 6. That is 6 babies die before the age of 1 for every 1,000 live births in the country. And that's high, right? If you compare that to East Asia or Northern Europe, it's very, very high. But if we broke this down at the level of groups, we can see that there's a really serious problem here, okay? So for whites, it's about 5.8, which is right at about what the national average is. For blacks, 13.6. If the white unemployment rate was a country, like if just white Americans were a country, then that infant mortality rate is comparable to Slovakia, which, is fine, but last I checked, people are not exactly banging down the door of the embassy to migrate to Slovakia. However, that's still a European Union member state. That's still a European country. It's not terrible infant mortality rate. However, if the black infant mortality rate was a country, it would be comparable to Sri Lanka, right? Which is a very low income country and one with a history of civil war, which absolutely drives up what you see at the infant mortality rate there. Latinos, not nearly as poor. I suspect the close-knit nature of many Latino communities has something to do with this, or the very family-oriented culture, but I'm honestly just speculating there. All I know is that I can see that groups have very different infant mortality rates. And in the case of access to healthcare, we know that as a result of the unequal distribution of healthcare resources, there often aren't a lot of hospitals or places to go for pre and neonatal care during a pregnancy. You often have a lot of urgent care or walk-in clinics in low-income communities that are overwhelmingly inhabited by Black residents, and not having a job that allows you to access healthcare creates a really serious problem. Okay, so whites are comparable to Slovakia here, blacks comparable to Sri Lanka. Maybe that will drive home the state of racial inequality within the United States. All right, pause for a second, just catch my breath, let you guys kind of get caught up here. All right. So when we think about life expectancy, there is a very serious black-white divide. Now, I have pointed out that women tend to live longer than men, generally speaking, but within across racial groups, if we just compare Black men to white men and Black women to white women, this has really serious consequences. Black men live on average 5 years less, and Black women live on average 3 years less than their white counterparts. And that's when you control for all sorts of other socioeconomic things. Now, what you're seeing on this graph here, this is really, really interesting to me. It is areas, anything you see in blue, that's an area where Blacks are more likely to die of those things than whites. And anything you see in green, that's an area where whites are more likely to die than Blacks. Let's start with a few things here. Heart disease, diabetes, perinatal conditions. These are all things that can be addressed through preventative care, through the ability to access preventative care. Cancer is another example of this. I already told the story about my dad's cancer, how it was caught very early, and as a result, he only needed surgery and without any of the extremely onerous radiation or chemotherapy treatments. So cancer, not catching it early does make you more likely to die of cancer, and homicide there too. We know that the murder rate is higher in very disadvantaged communities. However, if I look at the areas where whites have a disadvantage and are more likely to die, something like Alzheimer's, well, you have to age generally. Like, you have to age in order for that to happen to you. Black men are living 5 years less on average. Fewer of them are getting to that area of Alzheimer's or dementia. When we think about lower respiratory diseases, I don't really have much witty to say about that. But when I see unintentional injuries, I suspect that is highly driven by car accidents. Whites drive more than blacks. Really, access to cars is going to matter here. So that makes us more likely to die in a car accident. And then finally, suicide. This is a really interesting one. If you think about the conditions of racial inequality, it shouldn't seem that there would be a higher suicide rate for whites. But I strongly suspect that there's something going on here. This is the point where I would ask students to, kind of come up with answers, and most of you would probably come up with the wrong answer. And I'll just tell you, in my opinion, the reason why blacks are so much less likely to take their own lives than whites are, I suspect it has something to do with the Black church. It's about institutional participation. Is there an institution that takes on a very high level of importance within the Black community? The Black church does serve that purpose in a way that white church just doesn't, right? Statistically, in terms of how often you go, how often you spend time with other parishioners or congregation members, things like that. So if you've been following along here, we kind of went from, education to the quality of a job to the quality of your life. And now we get to the big driver of inequality, which is actually really wealth. The income gap is really narrowing between whites and blacks in the country. The wealth gap is not. Wealth is different from income, is that it's usually illiquid. It's stuff that can't be easily moved around. So think about things like retirement accounts. Think about the stock market. Think about, do you own a car, a house, a boat, it's like a vacation home in Aspen, crap like that. Wealth is a little more meaningful than income. For starters, it protects you. If you get laid off, wealth gives you an asset to fall back on. Secondly, wealth allows you to borrow again in the future. If you have wealth, it allows you to package and collateralize that, and you can borrow money for whatever it is you want to do with that money. It essentially lubricates future economic transactions in a way that just cash in an envelope is never going to do. It also creates something for you to live off of in retirement, the golden years. So the average amount of wealth held by white households in the United States is over $110,000. You look at the average for Hispanic and blacks, it's under $10,000. That is like less than 1/10 of the amount of wealth that is being held, which leads me to really like what I think is the most important part for those of you that have to write for Friday, and the most important part for just understanding where people live and why they live there for any of you. Homeownership is the primary way in which Americans generate wealth. It's the biggest purchase most of us will ever make, and it's the most valuable thing most of us will ever own. So homeownership reflects our ability to access both financial markets and to access resources. So it looks like I just threw a Jackson Pollock painting up on the screen here. Let's walk through what this is. This is a racial dot map that has been created by the United States Census Bureau. Each person here is represented by a dot of a certain color. So areas that are shaded in generally blue, that's where whites are living. Shaded in green, that's where blacks are living. Red is Asian, Latino is orange. Even in a very diverse and generally a pretty tolerant and prosperous city, New York, right? My hometown, essentially, we can see that groups are just not sharing space. If groups aren't sharing space, they aren't sharing resources. And if there's racialized patterns in where people live, there will be racialized patterns in how people access resources. So I'm going to help orient you here a little bit because this map without any markers, it's a little bit hard to kind of wrap our minds around. So follow my cursor here. This area right here, that's the island of Manhattan. The white gap you see right here in the middle, that's Central Park. That's why it's white, because nobody is living there. So we can see the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side very white. Then you get into Spanish Harlem and Harlem up here, and then to Inwood and Washington Heights, which is a very Dominican part of New York City. The South Bronx over here, right up in this area over here, Queens, which is really, in my opinion, Queens is the biggest melting pot in the world. And surprising to me, people don't think about it in that way more often. And then down here, just south of Manhattan, that's Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn, also a pretty diverse area. Even in New York City, people are living in very segregated environments, even though there's no law that requires that happens. It's just the way things have worked out, okay? Now, when we look at Detroit, this is starting to get a little, this is starting to look like almost a map on a country. Detroit's your classic black-white city, and you will notice that the colors are not as bold this time. Well, that's because Detroit doesn't have the population density that New York does, so you don't see the same clustering. But I can see a very clear pattern here, a black central city and a white suburban area. So for those of you that are familiar with the Detroit area, you follow my cursor here, that line that I'm kind of drawing there, that is the dividing line. That's 8 Mile Road. That's the dividing line between the city of Detroit and the inner suburb of Wayne County. Over here, right on the east side over here, Grosse Pointe. Like these are the points over here. And you can see it literally is like crossing a street. This is taken on, it's like when you see a map and they make the countries on the map different colors so you can easily see when one starts and one ends. These are not different countries, and yet it very much seems that way. This part of Southwest Detroit is where Mexican Americans have generally been living lately. And then this little kind of cluster in here is Hamtramck. I think, at least. Don't quote me on that if you know Detroit better than me. Now I look at Chicago, and I can see, again, very clear segregation. Part of this is something that like if you're from that area, if you are from Detroit and you want to see this, just drive around the city and look out your window and look at the people who you see. If you live in the Chicago area, get on a train at the first stop of a line and take that train all the way to the end of the line. And take note of who gets on and who gets off. You will see patterns. It's interesting being on public transportation because we're all kind of sharing the same space. We're all sharing this like very integrated tiny subway car, but all of a sudden people get on and people get off in very clear patterns, ethnically speaking. So you can see that there's a white north side of Chicago. I'll give you this is kind of the loop here. When there's just a lot of businesses and there isn't quite the same type of residential patterns. We have a white north side, a black south side, and generally a Hispanic Latino west side. And that's just the way Chicago is. If I look at Los Angeles, again, this honestly looks weirdly beautiful to me with the reds and yellows. It's almost like staring at a giant fish tank here. I kind of like it. But you can see that, yeah, LA is the nation's most diverse city. It's also one of the most segregated cities in the country. And you can see that, yeah, whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, everybody's represented in the Los Angeles area, but they live in different areas. And this is even before we get to what is the most segregated city in the entire country. Now, this is a point where I usually would ask students, like, what do you think is the most segregated city in the country? So please think about this just for a second while I stretch, and think about your guess. All right, I don't suspect anybody would have said it, but if I told you that segregation is always most severe in either the Northeast or the Midwest and in older industrial cities because the neighborhoods are just a lot older, that might have helped you get to Milwaukee, which is just breathtaking to me. For starters, I don't know if you've ever been to Milwaukee. I feel like I could go for miles, just walk for miles in Milwaukee without seeing another living person. But apparently people do live in Milwaukee, just not anywhere near each other. So I can see this is the most segregated city in the country. Blacks, whites, and Latinos just not sharing any type of space together. This, to me, I made the joke earlier about Milwaukee being, or about, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, I made the joke earlier about some of these maps kind of looking like a map of countries. Like you look at a map of Europe where the countries are kind of small and you have to make them different colors. This looks like it could be a nation, like a map of a region with different countries. North side, south side, and west side, Milwaukee are not different countries. Or maybe they feel that way, okay? So I want to be clear on this. If we think about where people are living, that's a great segue into the material that has to be consumed for Friday. Minorities tend to live in segregated areas kind of because they can't generate the wealth to move elsewhere. We live in a country in which you and me, we get some say over where we choose to live. We get some say over that. The patterns that emerge are revealing the fault lines of society. The reason why Black households have always tried to move into white neighborhoods, it's got nothing to do with any type of emotional value that may come from living around people of a different background. And it's got everything to do with that Black households generally know and understand that this is the way to access better resources, to get better public schools, to get better public safety, to get better businesses in the local community. So where you live and the income base, we've already established how income and wealth is connected to racial background. That then influences the types of schools that your children are going to be going to. It influences the types of jobs that you might be able to get. It influences the types of risks that that you will be prone to. It affects your public safety. In other words, it affects absolutely everything. I absolutely cannot stress this enough. Your zip code is a better predictor of your life outcomes than your genetic code, and it is not even close. So going forward then, I want you to consume the materials, right? I want you to consume the podcast and the article for Friday and think deeply about these questions. Is how does place matter, right? We live in a country in which you can live wherever you want. The fact that we see such high levels of segregation, what does that mean for racial inequality going forward? What does that mean for the type of country that we ultimately want to be going forward? All right. So Group A, you are up for me this week. I will expect you to turn in your reaction paper 9:15 a.m. Friday. That's all I got for you. Thank you very much. I will be in virtual office hours on Thursday. And stay well, guys. I miss you. I really miss being able to see you guys in the morning. So take care of yourselves. Be well.